The dropship intercepted Sion 20 kilometers from the capital city. She had been flying the stolen skimmer on manual controls for nearly 2 hours, and her hands were shaking from exhaustion. When the shadow passed over her, she looked up and saw a human military vessel descending through the amber clouds. For a moment, she thought it might be a hallucination. 4 days without proper food or water could do strange things to the mind. But the dropship was real. It landed beside her, and the cargo ramp lowered to reveal a squad of Marines in full combat armor. A man stepped forward and removed his helmet. He was Korean like her, with a face that showed both concern and admiration. "Commander Yoon Seoin?" He asked. "I am Captain Bay." Minho of the UEC Relentless. "You found me," she said, and her voice cracked from dehydration. "Your signal reached us through Officer Park, and we have been tracking you since the hunter team went silent." He handed her a canteen, and she drank greedily while his medic began treating her. "Burns and cuts. Galactic Council observers are aboard my ship." Captain Bay continued. "We have the evidence you transmitted, and we have additional testimony from a Dominion officer named Kelleth." "Kelleth survived?" Officer Park extracted him before Torval's security forces could make an arrest. Seoin closed her eyes and felt something loosen in her chest. She had hoped that Kelleth would help, but she had not dared to believe he would risk everything. "I need to confront Torval," she said. "I know," Captain Bay replied. "That is why we are here." The dropship flew low over the capital city and landed at the main government complex while Dominion security forces watched in confusion. They had received no warning of a human military presence, and their commanders were frantically trying to contact Chief Magistrate Torval for instructions. But Torval was already aware of the situation. He stood in his private chambers watching the tactical display with growing dread. The single hunter who escaped the Expanse had reported what happened, and Torval understood now that his plan had failed completely. The human diplomat was alive. Human soldiers were in his capital, and the Galactic Council was about to receive evidence of his crimes. He summoned his most loyal guards and prepared to flee through the service. Tunnels beneath the complex, he would disappear into the outer territories and rebuild his power somewhere beyond the Council's reach. He never made it to the tunnels. When he turned to leave his chambers, he found Commander Yoon Seoin standing in the doorway. She was burned and battered, and her uniform was torn and stained with blood and salt. But her eyes were clear and steady, and her voice did not waver when she spoke. "Chief Magistrate Torval," she said, "by the authority of the Galactic Council, you are under arrest for weapons trafficking and conspiracy to murder a diplomatic envoy." Torval's 4 eyes went wide with shock. "How did you get in here?" he demanded. "Your guards are otherwise occupied," Captain Bay answered as he stepped into view behind her. "And your security systems seem to have experienced a temporary malfunction." Torval looked at the woman who should have been dead, and he could not understand what he was seeing. "The Expanse kills everyone," he said, and his voice was barely a whisper. "No one survives more than 3 days. I survived 4. Seoin replied, "And I would have survived longer if I needed to." "That is impossible. For your species, perhaps, but not for mine." Torval's expression shifted from shock to desperate calculation. He reached for the weapon hidden beneath his robe, but Captain Bay was faster. The captain's sidearm was out and aimed before Torval's hand touched metal. "Do not," Captain Bay warned. "Give me a reason, and I will end this right now." Torval slowly raised his hands in surrender. "You cannot do this," he said. "I am the Chief Magistrate of the Kethvoran Dominion, and this is an act of war." "Actually, it is not." A new voice announced. Kelleth entered the chamber accompanied by 2 Galactic Council enforcers and a recording drone that captured everything. "I have provided the Council with evidence of your crimes," Kelleth continued, "including the falsified charges against Commander Yoon and your illegal weapons trade with the Vraxian Syndicate." "You traitor," Torval spat. I prefer the term whistleblower, Keleth replied, and for what it is worth. I hope the Dominion becomes something better after you are gone. The Council enforcers moved forward and placed restraints on Torval's wrists while the recording drone documented every moment as they led him past. Sioin, the chief magistrate, paused and looked at her with something that might have been respect or might have been fear. Hope the vultures reach you first, he muttered, and his own words sounded hollow now that they had been proven meaningless. A voice behind him spoke, and it was Captain Bay. They did not. Torval said nothing more as the enforcers escorted him from the chamber. 3 days later, Commander Yoon Sinjoin stood before the Galactic Council and delivered her testimony. She described the evidence she had discovered and the false charges Torval had used to silence her, and the 4 days she spent surviving in a place designed to kill her. When she finished, a council representative asked a question that had been on every alien mind since word of her survival spread. Commander Yoon, how did you survive in an environment that has killed every prisoner ever sent there? Sioin considered her answer carefully. The expanse is hostile, she admitted. The heat is brutal, and the water is poisoned, and the creatures are designed to hunt weakened prey. She paused and looked around the chamber at the dozens of species watching her with fascination. But humans evolved on a planet that tried to kill us every day for millions of years, and we survived ice ages and plagues and predators that should have wiped us out, and we kept going because that is what we do. 3 days in a desert is nothing compared to what my ancestors endured, and I had one advantage that no other species seems to understand. What advantage? The representative asked. I never once considered giving up, Sioin answered. The thought did not cross my mind, because surrender is not in our nature, and we do not know how to quit, even when logic says we should. The chamber fell silent. Finally, another representative spoke, and this one was from a species that had been skeptical of humanity's admission to the galactic community. What would you call a place like the Expanse? They asked. Sioin smiled, despite the pain that still lingered in her body. A challenge? She said, nothing more. 1 year later, Commander Yoon Sioin returned to Kethvora as the official human ambassador to the Pablai. Reformed Dominion government Keleth had been appointed to the Transitional Council, and he greeted her at the spaceport with a formal bow. Welcome back, Ambassador, he said. It is good to be back under better circumstances, she replied. They walked together through the capital city and everywhere. They went. Kethvorn stopped to stare at the human who had survived the unsurvivable. You have become something of a legend here, Keleth observed. I did not ask for that. Perhaps not, but you earned it, and my people needed to see that strength does not come from cruelty. Sioin looked toward the horizon where the expanse stretched beyond the city limits. The desert was still there, and it would always be dangerous, but it no longer held any fear for her. What happened to the vultures? She asked. Keleth smiled. They still circled the expanse waiting for prey, but the hunters say they avoid the area where you made your stand. Why? Because even animals learn to recognize a predator when they see one. Sioin laughed, and it was the first time she had truly laughed since before her arrest. She had come to Kethvora as a diplomat and been condemned as a spy, and survived as a warrior. Now she returned as a symbol of something that no species in the galaxy had fully understood until they witnessed it. Firsthand, humanity did not conquer challenges, humanity endured them, and that was far more terrifying to the galaxy than any weapon they could have built. The hunters arrived at dawn on the 4th day. 3-armed skimmers descended from the amber sky and landed in a triangular formation around the rock formations where Sein had made her shelter. She watched them from a hidden position high on the boulder and counted the enemies as they emerged from their vehicles. 12 Kethvoran soldiers in light combat armor carrying plasma rifles and scanning equipment. Their leader was a tall female with scars across her face and the confident stance of someone who had killed many times before, spread out and find her. The leader commanded. The chief magistrate wants confirmation of death. Before nightfall, the soldiers moved in pairs through the maze of boulders, while Sion observed their patterns and waited for the right moment. They were trained and disciplined. But they had never hunted in the expanse before. They did not know the terrain the way she did now. The first pair walked directly into her trap. The thin crust covering the pit collapsed under their weight, and they fell into a hole lined with sharp rocks. One of them screamed as a jagged stone pierced his leg, and his partner called for help while trying to pull him free. The commotion attracted the vultures. 3 of the massive creatures descended from the sky and landed near the injured soldier. Their black glass eyes locked onto the blood spreading across the white salt, and their clicking calls grew loud and hungry. "Get them off me!" The wounded soldier shouted. His partner fired at the vultures, but the plasma bolts only made them angry. One of them lunged forward and grabbed the wounded soldier by the arm and dragged him across the ground while the others moved to surround the second soldier. More hunters rushed to help, but the vultures did not retreat. They had found prey, and they were not going to give it up easily. Sion used the chaos to move. She slipped between boulders and circled behind 2 hunters who had separated from the main group. They were scanning for heat signatures and did not see her until she was already behind them. She struck the first one in the back of the knee with a heavy stone, and he collapsed with a cry of pain. The second one turned and raised his rifle, but she was faster. She threw a handful of salt crystals into his face, and he staggered backward while clawing at his eyes. She grabbed the fallen soldier's rifle and fired twice. Both hunters went down and did not move again. The leader heard the shots and barked orders to her remaining soldiers. "She's armed now, and converge on my position." Sion did not wait for them to regroup. She ran deeper into the rock formations where the passages grew narrow and the hunters would have to move single file. She knew every twist and turn of this maze because she had spent 3 days memorizing it while the hunters had only been here for minutes. 2 more soldiers followed her into the narrow passage. She waited around a corner with the rifle raised and fired the moment the first one appeared. He fell backward into his companion, and both of them tumbled to the ground in a tangle of limbs and weapons. Sion did not waste ammunition on finishing them. She kept moving. The leader was shouting now, and her voice echoed through the rocks with increasing frustration. "She is one human, and you are professional soldiers, so find her and kill her." But the soldiers were afraid now. They had expected to find a dying prisoner crawling through the desert, and instead they found a warrior who had turned the expanse into a fortress. 3 more hunters died before noon. One stepped on a buried creature that Sion had placed in his path, and the animal's venomous bite sent him into convulsions. 2 others tried to climb the boulders to get a better vantage point, and the vultures took them from above. The remaining hunters clustered together near their skimmers and refused to pursue any further. The leader was furious, but she was also smart enough to recognize when a hunt had gone wrong. Call for reinforcements. She ordered one of her soldiers, "Tell the magistrate we need aerial support to flush her out." The soldier activated his communicator and began transmitting. Sion watched from her hidden position and felt her heart sink. She could fight soldiers on the ground, but she could not fight aircraft. If Torval sent gunships, she would have no way to escape. She needed to end this before help arrived. She checked the rifle's power cell and found enough charge for maybe 6 more shots. 6 shots, and 5 remaining soldiers plus the leader made 6 targets. She would not miss. She emerged from cover and fired. The soldier at the communicator fell first, and his transmission died with him. The leader dove behind a skimmer while her remaining soldiers scattered and returned fire. Plasma bolts scorched the rocks around Sion, but she was already moving. She fired again, and another hunter dropped. Then another. The leader was screaming orders, but no one was listening anymore. The surviving soldiers ran for the skimmers, and one of them managed to lift off before Sion could stop him. She let him go because she had bigger problems. The leader had circled behind her, and now they faced each other across an open stretch of salt flat with no cover. For either of them, you killed my soldiers, the leader said, and her voice was cold with fury. They were trying to kill me first. Sioin replied, put down the weapon and I will make your death quick. Sioin raised the rifle and checked the power cell. 2 shots remaining. The leader saw the gesture and smiled. You are almost empty, she observed, and I have a full cell. Then why are you talking instead of shooting? The leader's smile faltered. She had not expected defiance from a prisoner who should have been dead 3 days ago. What are you? She asked, and there was genuine confusion in her voice. I am human, Sioin answered, and we do not know how to quit. The leader raised her rifle and fired. Sioin was already moving. She dove to the side, and the plasma bolt scorched the ground where she'd been standing. She rolled and came up firing, her first shot hit the leader in the shoulder and spun her around. Her second shot hit the leader in the chest, and she collapsed onto the white salt without another sound. Sioin stood alone in the silence that followed. The vultures circled overhead, but they did not descend. They had learned to fear this particular prey. She collected weapons and supplies from the fallen hunters, and then she walked to the undamaged skimmer. She did not know how to fly it, but she could figure it out. She had survived 4 days in a place where no one survived more than 2. Learning to operate a simple vehicle was nothing compared to that. On the UEC, relentless Captain Bei Minho studied the tactical display and watched a single contact moving across the desert toward the capital city. Is that her? Keleth asked. The signal matches the skimmer configuration from the hunter team. Jiwoo confirmed, and she is heading in the wrong direction. She is not running, Captain Bei said, and a smile spread across his face. She is going after Torval. Alone? Keleth's voice rose with disbelief. That is insane. No, Captain Bei replied. That is human. He turned to his tactical officer and began issuing orders. Launch the dropship and tell the Marines to intercept Commander Yoon before she reaches the capital. Sir, she has survived 4 days in hell and killed a hunter team by herself, but I'm not going to let her fight an entire government alone. The dropship detached from the Relentless and descended toward the desert world. Below, Commander Yoon Sun is about to receive reinforcements. And Chief Magistrate Torval was about to learn what happened when you underestimated humanity. The third day in the expanse began with Sioin crawling through a narrow tunnel she had discovered beneath the rock formations. Her uniform was torn, and her knees were bleeding, but she did not stop because at the end of this tunnel was something that could save her life. The transport shuttle that brought her to this place had been damaged during a sandstorm 6 months ago. The Dominion never bothered to retrieve it because anything valuable had already been stripped by scavengers, and the hull was too corroded to be worth salvaging. But Sioin was not looking for valuable things. She was looking for metal. The shuttle's wreckage lay half buried in a sand drift at the edge of a shallow crater. Most of it was useless but buried. Beneath the pilot's console, she found what she needed, a small emergency transmitter with enough power remaining for a single short-range burst. It would not reach orbit, but it did not need to. Jiwoo had told her during their first meeting months ago that human operatives always carried receivers tuned to emergency frequencies. If Jiwoo was still in the capital, then this signal would reach her. Sioin pried the transmitter free and examined it carefully. The casing was cracked, and the antenna was bent, but the internal components seemed intact. She would need to repair it before she could send a signal, and that meant finding wire and a power source. The shuttle's battery was long dead, but the chemical cells might still hold a charge if she could extract them safely. She spent 3 hours working in the shade of the wreckage while the vultures circled overhead. They were growing bolder now. One of them landed less than 20 meters away and watched her with those black glass eyes while she worked. Sioin ignored it and kept her movements slow and deliberate. The vulture wanted her to panic. she would not give it the satisfaction. By midday, she had assembled a crude transmitter that might work if she was lucky. She carried it back to her shelter and waited for nightfall when the atmospheric interference would be lowest. In the capital city, Chief Magistrate Torval was growing concerned. His spies had reported unusual activity among the off-world merchants, and several of his communication officers had noticed encrypted signals being transmitted from the merchant district. He summoned his security chief to his private chambers and demanded an explanation. The human cargo merchant. The security chief reported, Park Ji-woo is her name, and she has been in contact with someone outside Dominion space. Torval's 4 eyes narrowed with suspicion. What kind of contact? We cannot decrypt the transmissions, but our analysts believe she is coordinating with a military vessel. Human military? Almost certainly. Torval slammed his fist against the arm of his chair and cursed in his native tongue. He had underestimated the humans. He assumed they would file diplomatic protests and demand investigations that would take months to resolve. He did not expect them to send soldiers. Find out what she knows, he ordered, and increase surveillance on all human vessels in our space. There is another concern, the security chief added, and his voice dropped to a near whisper. One of our officers has been accessing classified communication logs without authorization. Which officer? Junior Officer Kelleth, assigned to the Evidence Processing Division. Torval remembered the young Kethvoron from the trial. He had seen something in Kelleth's eyes that day, and now he understood what it was. Doubt. Arrest him, Torval commanded, and arrest the human merchant as well before she can cause any more problems. The security chief bowed and left to carry out his orders, but he was already too late. Ji-woo had anticipated this moment from the beginning. Her ship lifted off from the landing pad just as Dominion security forces arrived to arrest her. She transmitted a final message to the waiting human vessel as she broke through the atmosphere. The magistrate knows something is wrong, she reported, moving to secondary position and awaiting the commander's signal. Copy that. The voice replied, Recovery team is ready to launch on your confirmation. Understood, and there is one more thing you should know. Go ahead. There is a Dominion officer named Kelleth who helped us, and he is in danger now. Can you extract him? Ji-woo looked at her navigation display and calculated the risks. I can try, she answered. Do it if possible, but the primary mission is Commander Yoon. I know. Ji-woo changed course and headed back toward the capital city. She was not going to leave an ally behind if she could help it. In the expanse, the sun finally set, and Seoin activated her makeshift transmitter. The device hummed and sparked, and for a terrible moment she thought it would fail. Then a small light flickered on, and she knew the signal was broadcasting. She transmitted a simple code that Ji-woo would recognize along with coordinates based on her position relative to the rock formations and the crash shuttle. The signal lasted for 12 seconds before the power cell died. 12 seconds was enough. Seoin destroyed the transmitter so that it could not be traced, and then she began preparing for what came next. She knew that Torval would detect the signal. She knew that he would send hunters to finish what the desert could not, and she knew that she needed to be ready when they arrived. She spent the night setting traps. She dug shallow pits in the salt crust and covered them with thin layers of debris that would collapse under weight. She collected the small creatures that lived beneath the surface and placed them in strategic locations where their movement would attract the vultures. She found sharp rocks and positioned them where someone running in the dark might trip and fall. By dawn, she had transformed the area around her shelter into a killing ground. The vultures sensed the change. They circled lower than before, and their clicking calls grew more frequent as if they were communicating with each other about the strange behavior of their prey. Seoin watched them and smiled despite her cracked lips and burning skin. Come and get me, she whispered, but she was not talking to the vultures. She was talking to whoever Torval sent to hunt her down in the capital city. Keleth ran through back alleys with Dominion security forces close behind. He had been warned by a message that appeared on his personal device just before the arrest order was issued. The message contained only 2 words: "Run now." He did not know who sent it, but he trusted it because the alternative was imprisonment and probably death. He reached a service entrance to the spaceport and found a figure waiting for him in the shadows. It was Park Ji-woo. "How did you know where I would go?" he gasped as she pulled him through the door. "Because it is the only place that makes sense," she replied. "Now stop talking and keep moving." They reached her ship just as security forces surrounded the spaceport. Ji-woo launched without clearance, and the Dominion defense grid lit up with targeting warnings. "They are going to shoot us down," Keleth said, and his voice was high with panic. "No, they are not," Ji-woo answered calmly. "Watch." A human warship dropped out of faster-than-light, traveled directly in front of them, and positioned itself between Ji-woo's small vessel and the Dominion defense platforms. The warship broadcast a message on all frequencies. "This is the UEC Relentless to Dominion Defense Command, and any hostile action against civilian vessels will be considered an act of war." The targeting warnings disappeared. Ji-woo guided her ship toward the warship's docking bay and let out a breath she had been holding since takeoff. "Welcome to the human side of this conflict," she told Keleth. "Thank you for saving me," he replied. "Do not thank me yet," Ji-woo said, and her expression grew serious. "We still have to save Commander Yoon and Chief Magistrate. Torval just sent hunters into the expanse to kill her." Keleth looked at the desert world growing smaller in the viewport. "Will she survive?" Ji-woo did not answer immediately. "She is human," she finally said. "If anyone can survive, she can." The Chamber of Judgment smelled like rust and fear. Commander Yoon Se-jin stood with her hands bound behind her back as the crowd of aliens watched her from raised seats that circled the room. Like a stadium designed for cruelty, she was the only human in this place. The Kethvoran Dominion had ruled this sector for 300 years, and they had never once shown mercy to those who challenged their authority. Sioin knew this when she accepted the diplomatic assignment, and she knew it now as Chief Magistrate Torval descended from his throne to stand before her. He was tall and gray-skinned with 4 arms folded across his chest like a judge who had already decided the verdict before the trial began. "You stand accused of espionage against the Dominion," Torval announced, and his voice echoed through the chamber with practiced authority. "You were caught transmitting classified military data to foreign powers, and you have been found guilty by this court." Sioin did not flinch. She had expected this from the moment the Dominion guards dragged her from her quarters in the middle of the night cycle. They had not even bothered to fabricate convincing evidence, because they did not need to on Kethvora. The word of the chief magistrate was law, and Torval wanted her silenced before she could reveal what she had discovered. "I am a diplomatic envoy of the United Earth Coalition," Sioin said, and her voice remained steady despite the weight of chains on her wrists. "I have committed no crime, and I demand to speak with my government's representatives." Laughter rippled through the chamber. Torval smiled with teeth that were sharp and numerous, and his 4 eyes narrowed with amusement at her defiance. "Your government has no authority here," he replied, and he gestured toward the windows where the harsh light of twin suns poured through. "You are in Dominion space, and you will face Dominion justice." He paused for effect, and the crowd grew silent in anticipation. The sentence for espionage is death by the expanse. A murmur of excitement passed through the spectators. Sioin had heard of the expanse during her months on Kethvora, but she had hoped she would never see it for herself. It was a vast desert of toxic salt flats and scorching heat where the Dominion abandoned its worst criminals to die slowly under the twin suns. No one survived the expanse. The creatures that lived there were called vultures by the locals, and they were patient hunters that circled dying prey for days before descending to feed. Most prisoners lasted less than 48 hours before the heat and poison and despair claimed them. The vultures always finished what the desert started. Do you have any final words before your sentence is carried out? Torval asked, and his tone suggested he did not actually care what she might say. Cyan looked at him, and then she looked at the crowd of aliens who had come to watch her. Condemnation like entertainment, she saw fear in some of their faces, but she also saw something else in the eyes of a young Dominion officer who sat near the back of the chamber. His name was Kelleth, and she had spoken with him several times during her assignment. He was one of the few Kethforans who questioned the brutality of his own government, and she could tell from his expression that he knew she was innocent. I have nothing to say to this court, Sioin finally answered, but I want you to remember this moment. Chief Magistrate. Torval's smile faltered for just an instant before he recovered his composure. Take her away, he commanded, and 4 guards moved forward to grab her arms. As they dragged her toward the exit, Torval called out one final taunt that echoed through the chamber. Hope the vultures reach you first. He mocked, and his voice dripped with cruel satisfaction. They are more merciful than the sun. The crowd laughed again, but Sioin did not look back. She kept her eyes forward as the guards led her through stone corridors toward the transport that would carry her to her execution. She did not struggle or beg, or show any sign of the terror that Torval expected from his victims. This confused the guards. They had seen hundreds of prisoners make this final walk, and almost all of them broke down before they even reached the transport bay. But this human remained calm, as if she was walking to a meeting rather than her death. One of the guards leaned close to his companion and whispered something about how humans must be too stupid to understand their situation. Sioin heard him, but she did not react. She was thinking about the transmission she had sent 3 days ago. Before the Dominion arrested her, she had managed to upload her evidence to a secure channel that would reach a human vessel operating in neutral space. The evidence detailed Torval's illegal weapons trade with hostile factions that threatened both human and allied species. If that transmission reached its destination, then her capture would trigger a response. She just had to survive long enough for help to arrive. The transport was a battered shuttle with no seats in the cargo hold. The guard shoved her inside and locked the door without removing her restraints. Through a small window, she watched the capital city shrink as the shuttle climbed into the amber sky. The flight lasted 2 hours. When the shuttle finally descended, she saw the expanse stretching to the horizon in every direction. It was a wasteland of white and gray salt flats broken only by jagged rock formations that rose from the ground like broken teeth. The twin suns hung overhead, and even through the shuttle's hull she could feel the brutal heat that waited outside. The shuttle landed, and the cargo door opened. A guard grabbed her by the collar and threw her onto the cracked earth with enough force to knock the wind from her lungs. She heard them laughing as they removed her restraints and tossed them back into the shuttle. 3 days. One of them said as the cargo door began to close. That is longer than most. Then the shuttle rose into the sky and left her alone in the most hostile environment on Kethvora. Sioin lay on the ground for a moment and felt the heat pressing down on her like a physical weight. The air tasted like metal and chemicals, and each breath burned her throat. She could already feel her skin beginning to redden under the harsh light. But she did not panic. She pushed herself to her feet and surveyed her surroundings with the trained eye of someone who had survived hostile environments before. To the east, she saw a cluster of rock formations that might provide shade. To the west, the salt flat extended without interruption toward a distant shimmer. That might be a canyon or might be a mirage. Above her, the sky was empty, except for 3 dark shapes that circled in the distance. The vultures had already spotted her. Sioin took a deep breath and ignored the burning in her lungs. Then she started walking toward the rocks. She was not going to die in this desert. She was going to survive long enough to watch Torval answer for his crimes. And somewhere in the capital city, a young officer named Kelleth was already searching through communication. Logs for proof that the chief magistrate had condemned an innocent woman. The desert was vast and merciless and filled with creatures that wanted to eat her. But Yunseon was human, and humans did not know how to quit. "Hope the vultures reach you first." The chief mocked. A voice behind him said the first night in the expanse was colder than Seoin expected. She had found shelter in a narrow crack between two massive boulders where the twin suns could not reach her during the day and where the wind could not steal her body heat after dark. Most species would have spent those first hours crying or praying or simply waiting to Seoin and spent them working. She tore strips from her uniform and wrapped them around her hands to protect her skin from the sharp salt crystals that covered everything. She found a flat stone with a jagged edge and tested it against her palm until she was satisfied it could cut. She collected small rocks and arranged them in patterns that would tell her which direction she had already explored by the time the sun set. She had a shelter and a tool and a system. She did not have food or water, but those problems would have to wait until morning. The vultures circled overhead. Even in the darkness, she could hear their wings beating against the cold air, and occasionally she saw their shadows pass across the stars. They were waiting for her to weaken. She closed her eyes and forced herself to sleep, because rest was a weapon she could not afford to waste in the capital city of Kethvora. The young officer named Kelleth sat alone in his quarters and stared at the data screen. Before him, he had spent 6 hours searching through classified communication logs, and what he found made his stomach turn with disgust. Chief Magistrate Torval had fabricated every piece of evidence against the human diplomat. The transmission she allegedly sent to foreign powers was actually a message Torval himself had created and planted. In the system, the classified military data she supposedly stole did not exist until Torval's technicians manufactured it 3 days before her arrest. Commander Yoon Seon was completely innocent, and Kelleth now understood why Torval wanted her dead so badly. The real transmission she sent before her capture contained evidence of Torval's illegal weapons trade with the Vraxian Syndicate. If that evidence reached the Galactic Council, then Torval would face execution for treason against multiple allied species. He had silenced her to protect himself. Kolth saved copies of everything he found and encrypted them with codes that only he could unlock. Then he did something that could get him killed. He left his quarters and walked through the night streets of the capital toward a district where off-world merchants gathered to trade goods that the Dominion did not officially approve. Was looking for a human. Her name was Park Jiwoo, and she operated a small cargo business that moved supplies between neutral stations and Dominion ports. Kelleth had met her once during an inspection, and she had seemed like someone who knew more than she revealed. He found her ship docked at a private landing pad, surrounded by crates of machine parts and medical supplies. She was sitting on the loading ramp and checking inventory on a handheld device. When he approached, "I know who you are," Jiwoo said without looking up from her screen. "You are the officer who processed my cargo 3 months ago. I need to speak with you about Commander Yoon Seon," Kelleth replied, and his voice was barely above a whisper. Jiwoo finally looked at him, and her eyes were sharp and calculating. "The diplomat they sent to the Expanse," she said, and it was not a question. "What about her?" "She is innocent, and I have proof." Kelleth held out a data chip, and Jiwoo stared at it for a long moment before she took it from his hand. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "Because I cannot save her alone," Kelleth answered, "and because I believe you are not really a cargo merchant." Jiwoo smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "You are smarter than most Kethvorans," she said, and she stood from the ramp. "Come inside and tell me everything you know." Back in the Expanse, the second day began with Seoin waking to the sound of wings directly above her shelter. A vulture had landed on the boulder, and was peering down at her with eyes like black glass. It was larger than she expected, with a wingspan that could have covered 3 humans standing side by side. Its body was covered in scales rather than feathers, and its beak was lined with teeth designed for tearing flesh. Zane did not move. She watched the creature watching her, and she forced herself to breathe slowly despite the fear that hammered in her chest. Vulture tilted its head and made a clicking sound deep in its throat. It was testing her sign, had studied predator behavior during her survival training, and she knew that many hunters relied on movement to identify prey. She remained perfectly still for what felt like hours until the vulture finally grew bored and lifted off to rejoin its companions in the sky. She exhaled slowly and made a mental note. The vultures were patient, but they were not intelligent. They followed patterns that she could learn to predict. She spent the second day searching for water. The Dominion guards had told her that nothing survived in the expanse, but Sioin knew that was a lie because the vultures had to drink something. She followed their flight paths and watched where they descended, and eventually she found what she was looking for: narrow canyon cut through the rock formations. Half a kilometer from her shelter, at the bottom of that canyon, was a pool of murky liquid that collected from condensation during the cold nights. Water was contaminated with minerals that would make her sick if she drank too much at once, but small sips filtered through fabric would keep her alive. She drank carefully and filled a hollow rock she had found to carry water back to her shelter. On her way back, she noticed something else. The salt flats were not completely barren. Small creatures lived beneath the crust and emerged at night to feed on whatever organic matter the wind carried across the desert. These creatures were the vultures' primary food source. Sioin could use them. She spent the rest of the day planning, and by nightfall, she had the beginning of a strategy. She was not going to simply survive the expanse. She was going to turn it into a weapon in the capital city. Jiwoo finished reviewing the evidence that Keleth had provided, and then she activated a secure communication channel that connected to a ship waiting just outside Dominion space. "This is Jiwoo," she said into the transmitter. "The package is confirmed alive as of 18 hours ago, and we have proof of the magistrate's crimes." A voice crackled back through the speaker. "Understood," it said. "Recovery team is standing by, but we need confirmation of her current status before we can move. Working on it," Jiwoo replied. She transmitted a contingency signal before her arrest, and the equipment to receive it is hidden in my cargo hold. How long? If she is still alive, she will find a way to signal us, and if she does not? Jiwoo paused and looked at the data chip in her hand. "Then we come anyway," she answered, "and we make sure the chief magistrate answers for what he has done." The communication ended, and Jiwoo turned to find Keleth watching her with a mixture of fear and hope. "Your people are really coming for her," he said. "Of course we are," Jiwoo replied. "She is one of ours." Keleth shook his head slowly, as if he could not understand what he was hearing. "The Dominion would never risk soldiers for a single prisoner," he said. "That is because the Dominion does not understand humans," Jiwoo answered, and she began preparing her equipment. "We will not leave our people behind." In the expanse, the second night fell, and Sioin lay in her shelter listening to the vultures circle overhead. Her body ached, and her skin was burned, and her stomach cramped with hunger. But her mind was clear. She had water, and she had a plan, and somewhere out there, her people were coming. All she had to do was survive long enough to tell them where to find her.